Jisoo Park's hands trembled as she clutched the clipboard, her fingers tightening around the pen. The waiting room of Seoul Women's Health Clinic was pristine and modern, but no amount of soft lighting or calming music could ease the anxiety twisting in her stomach. She hated being here. Her heart pounded as she scanned the intake form in front of her. Name, date of birth, medical history. Simple questions, but her mind felt like a jumbled mess. She wiped her clammy hands on her jeans and forced herself to focus. Just fill out the form, Jisoo. It's not that hard. But it was hard. She had spent her whole life avoiding this moment, convincing herself she didn't need to see a gynecologist. But after weeks of discomfort and late-night internet searches that only fueled her worst fears, she had finally caved. The receptionist had highly recommended Dr. Min-jun Seo, one of the best in the city. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. To her, a doctor was just a doctor, old, serious, professional. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. A nurse stepped into the waiting room, holding a file. Jisoo Park. Jisoo nearly jumped. She swallowed hard, gripping her form like a lifeline. With wobbly legs, she stood and followed the nurse down a hallway. Her stomach churned as she passed closed exam rooms, the scent of antiseptic filling the air. "You can have a seat," the nurse said with a polite smile, gesturing to a chair inside the doctor's office. "Dr. Seo will be in shortly." Jisoo nodded, but she could barely breathe. She sat down stiffly, her back straight as a ruler, her hands clasped in her lap. The room was neat, framed certificates lined the walls, a sleek desk sat in the corner, and beside it, the exam chair loomed like something out of a horror movie. She tried not to stare at it, her fingers twisting together anxiously as she rehearsed what she would say. "Be calm. Be normal. Get through this." And that was when Jisoo forgot how to breathe altogether. The man who stepped inside was not the kind of doctor she had pictured in her head. Dr. Min-jun Seo was gorgeous, tall, broad-shouldered, effortlessly handsome. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, and his deep brown eyes held an easy confidence. He was not supposed to look like this. Jisoo's mouth went dry. "Mississippi Park?" His voice was smooth, calm, completely professional. He gave her a reassuring smile as he shut the door behind him. Jisoo tried to answer, but nothing came out. She was too busy panicking. He was young. He was attractive. He was going to examine her. Oh no. Min-jun sat down across from her, flipping through her file. "I see this is your first visit to a gynecologist?" Jisoo nodded so quickly she might have given herself whiplash. His smile remained gentle. "I know this can be nerve-wracking, but I promise we'll take things at your pace. Nothing happens unless you're comfortable." She nodded again, cheeks burning. Min-jun noticed the way she tensed, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she looked like she wanted to disappear into the chair. She was different from most patients he saw, shy, timid, fragile in a way that made something in him stir. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softer. "How are you feeling?" Jisoo clenched her hands together. "Fine," she lied. Min-jun chuckled, a warm, easy sound. "You don't have to be nervous. I promise, I'm not that scary." Jisoo begged to differ. He was terrifying, not because of who he was, but because of what he was making her feel. She had never reacted to anyone like this before. Her heart racing, her palms sweating, her body hyper-aware of his every move. And the worst part, Min-jun noticed. Min-jun noticed her body language, the way she avoided his gaze, the pink flush on her cheeks. She was adorable. He had met thousands of patients, confident ones, nervous ones, even some who flirted shamelessly. But Jisoo? Jisoo was different. Her vulnerability made him want to be careful with her. He had never been the type to mix emotions with work, but something about the way she looked at him, wide-eyed and hesitant, made him want to protect her. And that was a dangerous thought. He cleared his throat, pushing those feelings aside. "Focus, Min-jun. You're her doctor, not some guy in a bar." "Before we begin," he said, keeping his voice light, "do you have any questions for me?" Jisoo hesitated. She had a million questions, but every single one died in her throat. So she just shook her head. Min-jun's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if trying to decode her silence. Then he smiled again. "All right, let's get started." And Jisoo knew, without a doubt, this was going to be the longest appointment of her life. Jisoo practically sprinted out of the clinic that day. Her heart was still pounding as she walked down the busy sidewalk, her hands clammy, her cheeks still burning from embarrassment. She had never felt so out of place in her entire life. Dr. Min-jun Seo was too much. Too handsome. Too charming. Too intimidating. And the worst part? He had been kind, gentle, understanding. which somehow made things worse because that meant she couldn't even be mad at him. She was mad at herself, mad at the way her stomach had flipped when he spoke to her, mad at the way her skin tingled when he reached out to shake her hand, mad at the way she had nearly melted into a puddle on the floor just from looking at him. She could never go back. Not in a million years. But fate, as always, had other plans. For the next 2 weeks, Jisoo ignored every call from the clinic. Her prescription needed to be adjusted? Didn't care. She needed to schedule a follow-up? Not happening. But then her symptoms started getting worse, and no amount of avoiding the problem was going to make it go away. Which was how she found herself back in that same waiting room, gripping the arms of the chair like a lifeline. This time, she silently prayed that maybe she'd get a different doctor. Someone older. Someone boring. Someone who wouldn't make her entire brain short-circuit. But of course, life hated her. Because the moment the nurse called her name and led her back to the office, the person waiting for her was, once again, him. Dr. Min-jun Seo, looking as unfairly good as ever. He looked up from his file when she stepped in, and then he smiled. "Jisoo," he said, closing the folder. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." Her breath hitched. He noticed. Her stomach twisted as she quickly took a seat, keeping her gaze glued to the floor. "I wasn't," she stammered, lying through her teeth. Min-jun leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. His expression was gentle, amused, but also curious. "You missed your follow-up," he said. "And when we tried calling, you didn't answer." Jisoo felt like she was dying. I got busy," she mumbled. Min-jun didn't believe her for a second, but he let it slide. Instead, he studied her carefully. And somehow, knowing that made something inside him soften. He had seen thousands of patients, but none like Jisoo Park. Jisoo Park was trying not to pass out. Every second in this room felt like torture. She knew Dr. Min-jun Seo was just doing his job, that he wasn't thinking about this the way she was, but it didn't matter. She had to get out of here as soon as possible. The moment the appointment ended, she practically ran for the door, mumbling a thank you as she disappeared down the hall. Min-jun, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, felt a pang of disappointment as he watched her go. He didn't expect to see her again so soon. Not outside the clinic, not in a completely different setting. But a few days later, as he stepped into his favorite cafe to grab a coffee before heading to work, his eyes landed on a familiar figure sitting by the window, curled up with a book. Jisoo. She hadn't seen him yet, completely engrossed in the novel in front of her, occasionally tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, biting her lip in concentration. She looked peaceful here, different, not the bundle of nerves she had been in his office. And for some reason, that made Min-jun hesitate, because suddenly, she wasn't just a patient. She was someone he wanted to know, not just in a medical setting, not just as a name on a file, but as a person. As Jisoo. Taking a deep breath, he walked over. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, leaning slightly against the table. Jisoo froze mid-sip, her eyes widening as she looked up. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if her brain was still processing what was happening. Then she choked on her coffee. Min-jun tried not to laugh. Jisoo wanted to disappear, because for the second time in a row, Dr. Min-jun Seo had completely caught her off guard. Jisoo gripped her coffee cup tightly, her heart still racing from the shock of seeing him outside his clinic. She had barely recovered from her embarrassment, and now here he was, standing in front of her, impossibly composed, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. Hi, she stammered, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Min-jun chuckled, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I had no idea you came here," he said, glancing around the cafe. "This is my usual spot." Jisoo swallowed hard, trying not to panic. This was not where she expected to see him again. Outside of a medical setting, just casually sitting across from her like this was normal. I like the quiet," she mumbled, hoping he wouldn't notice how nervous she was. Min-jun smiled. "Me too." And just like that, an easy silence settled between them. For the first time, Jisoo allowed herself to really look at him. He was wearing a tailored dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. His entire presence was effortlessly polished, exuding confidence. He looked like someone who belonged to a completely different world than hers. And yet, here he was sitting across from her, looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. That thought terrified her. A few days later, Jisoo's world shifted again. She was absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone when she stumbled upon an article, and her stomach dropped. Dr. Min-jun Seo. the esteemed doctor behind CO Medical Group. She froze, heart pounding. She clicked on the article, her eyes widening with every word. Min Jun wasn't just a doctor. He was the doctor. A leading name in gynecology, a pioneer in women's health, with multiple hospitals under his name, including the very clinic she had visited. And on top of that, he was incredibly wealthy. Jisoo could barely breathe. It wasn't just that he was successful. It was the fact that she had been so naive. She had let herself believe, even for a second, that he was just a normal person. But now the truth was staring her right in the face. Min Jun Seo wasn't just some charming doctor. He was untouchable. And she was just Jisoo Park, an ordinary girl with an ordinary life, struggling to pay her rent, trying to figure things out one day at a time. They weren't equals. They weren't even close. And the sooner she accepted that, the better. Min Jun started noticing the change immediately. Jisoo was avoiding him. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then she started ignoring his texts, stopped coming to the cafe, stopped showing up for follow-up appointments. Suddenly, he realized he might actually lose her before he even had a chance to figure out what this was. That was unacceptable. So one evening, he found her. Jisoo had just finished her shift at the bookstore where she worked, her bag slung over her shoulder as she stepped onto the sidewalk. And then he was there, leaning against his sleek black car, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her. Jisoo's heart leaped into her throat. "Min Jun," she choked. His gaze never wavered. "Are you avoiding me?" His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something she had never heard before. Jisoo looked away. "No, I've just been busy." Min Jun exhaled, stepping closer. "Jisoo," he said, his voice quieter now. "Don't lie to me." She clenched her fists. "Why does it matter?" she asked. "You're you, and I'm me. We're from completely different worlds, Min Jun and I." She swallowed hard. "I don't want to be someone people think is chasing after you for your money." Min Jun stared at her for a long moment, then he laughed. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was genuine disbelief. Jisoo felt her cheeks heat. "Why are you laughing?" Min Jun shook his head, his expression softening. "Because, Jisoo," he murmured, "I think you're the first person in my life who's ever run away from me because of my money." Jisoo's lips parted, but she had no words. For the first time, she saw it, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he looked at her. Not as a doctor, not as a millionaire, but as a man who was simply trying to understand her. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure about running anymore. Jisoo Park was never comfortable with doctor visits. The idea of sitting in a sterile room, answering personal questions, and exposing vulnerabilities made her anxious. But after weeks of worrying about her health, she finally gathered the courage to schedule an appointment. What she hadn't expected was for her doctor to be incredibly attractive, making her even more nervous. "That I don't know what it feels like to be enough," Jisoo murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Min Jun, the doctor she had been so hesitant to see, let out a short breath, a bitter laugh escaping him. He shook his head. "No, Jisoo, it's not." She looked at him, surprised by the sharpness in his tone. She had always seen Min Jun as someone untouchable, successful, confident, in control. But now, for the first time, she saw something else. Something broken. Something real. "I wasn't always like this," Min Jun continued, rubbing his hands together absent-mindedly. "I didn't grow up with money. My parents worked hard, but we struggled. I put myself through med school with scholarships and part-time jobs." Jisoo held her breath, watching as he spoke. This wasn't the polished, composed doctor she had met. This was a man laying his heart bare. "When I finally became a doctor, when I started making real money, I thought I had made it. I thought, this is it. I've done everything right." His voice dropped lower. "And then I met someone." Jisoo's stomach twisted. "She was beautiful, smart, everything I thought I wanted. She said she loved me." Min Jun's jaw clenched. "I believed her." Jisoo already knew where this was going, yet she couldn't stop herself from whispering, "What happened?" Min Jun let out a slow breath. "She didn't love me," he said softly, his voice sharp with the weight of betrayal. "She loved my money." Jisoo felt her chest tighten painfully. Min Jun glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I found out she had been seeing someone else behind my back. That everything she said to me, everything we had, was just an act." Jisoo sucked in a sharp breath. She didn't know what to say because this was not the Min Jun she had imagined. This was not the perfect, confident doctor. This was a man who had been hurt, left with scars no one else could see. Just like her. "I haven't really let anyone in since then," Min Jun admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I tell myself I don't need to, that it's easier this way. He looked up at her then, his gaze burning into hers. But then I met you. Jisoo froze. Her heart stopped. And suddenly everything else disappeared. The hospital, the past, the fear. It was just him and her, and the unspoken truth between them. Jisoo, Minjun said, shaking his head. No, let me finish. He took a step closer. Jisoo's throat tightened. Minjun took another step, and now he was right in front of her, so close she could feel his warmth. I don't care what you have or don't have, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I don't care that you think you're not enough. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative, hesitant, almost like he was giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. All I care about, he murmured, is you. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky, the soft hum of the night filling the silence between them. And then Minjun cupped her face, tilting her chin up until their eyes met. I want you, Jisoo, he whispered. Just you. Jisoo's breath hitched. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. That night, Jisoo lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart tangled in emotions she couldn't untangle. Minjun's words echoed in her mind, soft but unshakable. I want you, Jisoo. Just you. She had spent so long believing she wasn't enough, that love wasn't meant for someone like her. And yet, Minjun had chosen her anyway. But could she do it? Could she let herself believe in this? In him? The next few days were a whirlwind of doubt. Jisoo avoided calling him, avoided making a decision, even though deep down, she already knew the answer. Because the truth was, when she imagined her life without Minjun in it, it felt empty. Cold. Like something was missing. Like he was missing. And that terrified her even more than the idea of falling for him. Miho, on the other hand, waited. He didn't push. Didn't demand an answer. Because he knew Jisoo. He knew she needed time. And as much as it killed him, he was willing to give her that. Because if it meant having her in the end, she was worth the wait. But Jisoo couldn't run forever. The moment it happened, she didn't think. Didn't weigh the consequences. Didn't hesitate. All she knew was that she needed to see him. So she ran through the crowded sidewalks, past the glowing city lights, her heart pounding in time with her footsteps, until finally, she reached his clinic. She burst through the doors, breathless, scanning the reception area until she saw him at the end of the hall, talking to a nurse. Miho turned at the sound of the door, his brows furrowing in surprise. But before he could say a word, Jisoo was already moving, straight to him, straight into his arms. And for the first time, she didn't hold back. Miho barely had time to react before Jisoo wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest, clutching onto him like he was the only thing keeping her standing. His body tensed in shock for half a second. Then he melted into her. His arms came around her, strong and steady, holding her like he'd never let go. Jisoo squeezed her eyes shut. Her voice was muffled against his shirt. Miho, I choose you. Miho's breath hitched, and in that moment he knew. She had chosen him. She had chosen them. And nothing else in the world mattered. 1 year later, Minjun took her back to the same cafe where it all began. Jisoo didn't think much of it at first. Not until she saw the nervous way he was fidgeting with his coffee cup. Not until he reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. Not until he dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the cafe, with a small velvet box in his hand and pure love in his eyes. Jisoo gasped, her heart lodging in her throat. Miho smiled up at her, his voice soft but full of certainty. Jisoo Park, will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision. A year ago she would have run. But now there was only one answer. Yes. The cafe erupted into cheers, but all Jisoo could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat and the quiet, unshakable promise in Minjun's gaze. That no matter what, they had found each other. And neither of them would ever be alone again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time with more exciting and sincere stories. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story.